It was a quiet afternoon as Officers Daniels and Carter drove slowly through the neighborhood in their police car. The sun was shining, and the streets were lined with big houses, neatly trimmed lawns, and expensive cars parked in driveways. It was a peaceful area, the kind of place where people felt safe. But for Daniels and Carter, their job was to stay alert, to watch for anything that seemed out of place. As they turned a corner, Carter nudged Daniels and pointed ahead. A teenage boy was walking alone on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking at his phone. He wore a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, with a small backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't running or acting suspiciously, just walking like any normal teenager would. Still, something about him made the officers take notice. Carter frowned. "You see that kid?" he muttered. Daniels nodded. "Yeah. What's he doing around here?" They exchanged a glance. Without discussing it further, Daniels flipped on the patrol lights for a second, signaling the boy to stop. The car pulled up beside him, and Carter rolled down his window. "Hey, kid, hold up a second," Carter called out. The boy stopped walking and looked up. His expression was calm but slightly confused. "Yes, sir," he said politely. Daniels and Carter stepped out of the car. They had done this 100 times before. A routine stop, nothing unusual. But for some reason, the way the boy stood there, unafraid, made Carter feel a little irritated. He expected hesitation, nervousness, maybe even fear. Instead, the boy just looked at them, waiting. "You live around here?" Daniels asked, folding his arms. "Yes," the boy replied. "I was just walking home." Carter narrowed his eyes. "Really? Where exactly do you live?" The boy gave an address a few blocks away. It was a house in the same neighborhood, but Carter and Daniels didn't recognize the street name. Carter smirked. "You got ID on you." The boy hesitated for a moment, then reached into his backpack. "I don't usually carry my ID when I'm just walking," he said. Daniels scoffed. "That's convenient." He took a step closer. "So, what's in the bag?" "Just my school stuff," the boy said, gripping the strap tightly. "Mind if we take a look?" Carter asked, though his tone made it clear that this wasn't really a request. The boy sighed. "Do I have to?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem." The boy opened his backpack, showing books, a notebook, and a few pens. Carter gave a quick glance but wasn't satisfied. He nodded toward the boy's pockets. "What about those?" The boy took a slow breath. "My phone and my house keys." Daniels reached out. "Let's see." The boy's grip tightened around his phone. His patience was running thin. "Why?" he asked. Daniels and Carter exchanged a look. They didn't have a real reason. They just didn't like his attitude. They wanted him to act nervous, to obey without question. But something about this kid felt different. And in just a few minutes, they would find out exactly why. Daniels and Carter stood there, watching the boy closely. They didn't like how calm he was. Most kids would be nervous, maybe even scared, when stopped by police officers. But this boy wasn't acting the way they expected. He wasn't rude, but he wasn't afraid either. That made them uncomfortable. Daniels reached out again. "Just let me see your phone for a second." The boy took a small step back. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." Carter crossed his arms. "Look, kid, we're just doing our job. If you don't have anything to hide, why are you acting so difficult?" The boy sighed and shook his head. "I'm not being difficult. I just don't understand why you're stopping me." Daniels exhaled sharply, annoyed. He didn't like being questioned. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area," he lied. "And you happen to be walking around here alone. Just cooperating would make this easier for everyone." The boy frowned. "Suspicious activity? I live here." Carter smirked. "Then you should have no problem answering a few simple questions." The boy clenched his jaw, frustrated. "I already told you where I live." Daniels looked at Carter, then back at the boy. "All right, turn around. Hands on your head." The boy's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "Standard procedure," Daniels said. "We just need to make sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." The boy hesitated. He looked around, noticing a few people walking by on the other side of the street. Nobody was stopping. They were watching, but no one was stepping in. He felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. Still, he didn't want to make things worse. Slowly, he turned around and laced his fingers behind his head. Daniel stepped forward and patted him down, his hands quickly moving over the boy's hoodie and jeans. His pockets only had a phone and house keys, just like he said. Carter opened the boy's backpack again, checking the books and notebooks more carefully this time, as if expecting to find something hidden. But there was nothing. Everything was completely normal. Daniels pulled the boy's phone out of his pocket and held it up. "Locked, huh? What's the passcode?" The boy turned his head slightly. "I'm not giving you my passcode." Carter let out a small laugh. "You sure you're not hiding something?" The boy stayed silent. His patience was wearing thin. Daniels gave him a warning look. "Listen, kid. You might think you're smart, but we do this every day. We can take you down to the station and let you explain everything there if you'd prefer." The boy exhaled through his nose, clearly frustrated but still keeping his cool. "For what? Walking home?" Daniels rolled his eyes. He was about to say something when his radio crackled. The voice from dispatch came through, sounding urgent. "Officers, do you have a name on the individual you stopped?" Daniels grabbed the radio. "Yeah, kid says his name is Darnell Harrison." There was a long pause. Then the voice came back, sharper this time. "Release him immediately. Do not engage further." Daniels and Carter froze. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Daniels and Carter stood still for a moment, confused by the sudden urgency in the dispatcher's voice. Carter exchanged a glance with Daniels, his expression shifting from confidence to slight concern. Why would dispatch tell them to release the boy so quickly? Something wasn't adding up. Daniels pressed the radio button again. "Come again. What's the issue?" The radio crackled before the dispatcher's voice came through, firmer this time. "Release him. Right now." Daniel's grip on the radio tightened. His eyes flickered toward the boy, who was still standing with his hands on his head. Carter noticed it too. Something was definitely off. But instead of following the order immediately, Daniels decided to push back. "Can you confirm why?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. A long silence followed. Then, in a sharp, almost frustrated tone, the dispatcher finally responded. "That's Chief Harrison's son." The words hit Daniels and Carter like a slap. For a second, neither of them moved. The boy, Darnell, turned his head slightly, watching their reactions. He had heard it too. Carter's mouth went dry. He took a step back from the boy, as if touching him would somehow make things worse. "Wait, Chief Harrison," he muttered under his breath. Daniel's face lost its color. The chief of police, their boss, the man who had the power to fire them on the spot, and they had just humiliated his son. Carter quickly moved to uncuff Darnell, his hand shaking slightly as he fumbled with the key. Okay, let's get these off," he mumbled, trying to sound casual, but the nervousness in his voice was clear. Darnell stayed quiet, watching them with an unreadable expression. His calmness now felt even more unsettling to the officers. It was like he had known this moment was coming. Daniels cleared his throat, forcing a fake smile. "Listen, kid, Darnell. This was just a misunderstanding." His voice was suddenly softer, trying to sound friendly. Carter nodded quickly. "Yeah, just a routine check. We didn't mean anything by it." Darnell flexed his wrists as soon as the cuffs were off. He rubbed the skin where they had been too tight. His phone was still in Daniel's hand, and he reached for it. Daniels hesitated for a split second before handing it back. Darnell glanced down at the screen. The recording was still going. He had captured everything. The realization hit Daniels and Carter at the same time. Their stomachs dropped. Daniels tried to laugh, but it came out awkward and forced. "No harm done, right? We're all good." Darnell didn't answer. He just stared at them, his expression calm but knowing. He could see their fear now. And in that moment, he understood. He had all the power. Before anyone could say another word, the radio crackled again. "Chief Harrison is on his way." Daniels and Carter stiffened. Their boss was coming, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Daniels and Carter stood frozen, their minds racing. Chief Harrison was on his way. Their boss, the most powerful man in the department, and they had just treated his son like a criminal. Carter swallowed hard. "Maybe we can fix this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniels nodded quickly, trying to think. Yeah. We'd just explain. It was all a misunderstanding." He turned to Darnell, forcing a smile. "Hey, listen, buddy. No hard feelings, right? We were just doing our job." Darnell didn't say anything. He just slipped his phone into his pocket and folded his arms. His expression remained unreadable, but his silence made the officers more nervous. A few minutes felt like forever as they stood there in awkward tension. Then the sound of tires screeching against the pavement made their stomachs drop. A sleek black SUV came to a sharp stop right behind the patrol car. The door swung open, and out stepped Chief Harrison. The chief was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in a sharp suit. His presence alone was intimidating. He didn't rush, didn't yell. He didn't need to. His cold, unreadable face was enough to make both officers break into a nervous sweat. He walked straight past them without even looking at them. Instead, he went directly to Darnell. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Darnell nodded. "I'm fine, Dad." The word Dad hit Daniels and Carter like a punch to the gut. It was one thing to hear it over the radio, but seeing it in person, that made it real. Chief Harrison placed a hand on Darnell's shoulder for a brief moment before finally turning to the two officers. His sharp eyes landed on Daniels first, then Carter. Neither of them could hold his gaze for more than a second. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, his voice calm, but the kind of calm that made it clear he was furious. Carter tried to speak first. "Sir, we were just..." "Stop." The chief's voice was like ice. "I don't want excuses. I want the truth." Daniels cleared his throat, forcing himself to stand straight. "Sir, we were patrolling the neighborhood, and we saw..." He hesitated, suddenly realizing how bad this was going to sound no matter how he worded it. Chief Harrison raised an eyebrow. "You saw what?" "A young man walking home." Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Carter tried to jump in. "We didn't know who he was, sir." The chief let out a slow, disappointed sigh. "You didn't need to know who he was. You only needed to treat him with respect." Silence. Neither officer had anything to say. The chief glanced at Darnell, then back at the officers. His next words sent chills down their spines. "Turn in your badges. You're done." Daniels and Carter felt their world crumble. Their careers over. In just 5 minutes, everything had changed. And now, there was nothing they could do to fix it. Daniels and Carter felt their stomachs drop. Did they hear that right? Turn in their badges. Just like that. Carter opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come out. Daniel's hands twitched slightly at his sides. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, to do something. But the look in Chief Harrison's eyes made it clear. There was no arguing, no second chances. Darnell stood silently beside his father, watching the officers squirm. He had nothing to say. He didn't have to. The situation spoke for itself. Daniels tried one last time. "Sir, please, if we could just..." Chief Harrison held up a hand, cutting him off. "No, you could have done the right thing 5 minutes ago. But you didn't. And now you're out of time." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made both officers feel even smaller. Carter felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. He had worked years to get this job. Losing it now, over one bad decision, he could feel sweat forming on the back of his neck. "Sir," he tried again, forcing a weak smile. "This was all just a misunderstanding. If we had known." "That's the problem," Chief Harrison said sharply. "You shouldn't have to know someone's name to treat them with basic respect." Carter swallowed hard. He couldn't argue with that. Daniels clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up. "We didn't hurt him," he muttered under his breath. Chief Harrison narrowed his eyes. "Did you need to?" He shook his head. "You humiliated him. You treated him like a criminal in his own neighborhood. And the worst part, you didn't even think twice about it." The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, without another word, Chief Harrison reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Daniels and Carter glanced at each other, unsure of what was coming next. A few seconds later, the chief spoke into the phone. "Send someone to collect the badges and weapons of Officers Daniels and Carter. They're no longer with the department." Carter felt his knees weaken. This was really happening. His career was over, just like that. Daniels took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. He wanted to protest, to say something that would make this all go away. But deep down, he knew there was no talking his way out of this. The chief ended the call and looked back at them. "Go back to the station," he said simply. "Hand in your gear. After that, you're done." Daniels and Carter hesitated. They wanted to say something. Maybe apologize. Maybe beg for another chance. But one look at Chief Harrison's face told them it wouldn't matter. With heavy steps, they turned toward their patrol car. Their hands felt empty, their futures uncertain. As they got into the car and drove off, Darnell watched them go, his phone still in his pocket. The recording was there, but he didn't even need it anymore. Justice had already been served. As the patrol car drove away, Darnell let out a slow breath. The tension in his shoulders eased, but he wasn't sure how to feel. He had just watched two officers lose their jobs in front of him. Part of him felt relieved. They had been wrong, and now they had to face the consequences. But another part of him felt something else. Not sadness, not guilt, but something close to disappointment. His father, Chief Harrison, stood beside him, silent for a moment. Then he turned to face his son. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again. Darnell nodded. "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine." The chief studied his son carefully, as if trying to see beyond his words. He knew Darnell well enough to know when something was bothering him. "Good," he said after a moment. "Let's go home." They walked to the black SUV, and as soon as they got in, the chief started driving. The air inside the car was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence where both people were thinking about the same thing but didn't know how to start the conversation. Finally, Darnell spoke. "Did you have to fire them?" His father didn't take his eyes off the road. "Yes." His voice was firm, but not harsh. Darnell looked down at his hands. "They messed up, yeah, but they didn't hurt me." The chief sighed. "No, they didn't. But they could have. And that's the problem." He glanced at his son briefly before returning his focus to the road. "They didn't see you as a kid walking home. They saw you as a problem. And if I hadn't stepped in, they might have never questioned why that was wrong." Darnell nodded slowly. He understood, but he still felt uneasy. "They were scared when they found out who I was," he said. "If I had been just some regular kid, they wouldn't have cared." Chief Harrison tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I know." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, an anger he was holding back. Darnell leaned his head against the window, watching the houses pass by. He had lived in this neighborhood his whole life. He had never thought of it as dangerous. But today, he realized something. It wasn't about where he lived. It was about who he was. His father pulled into their driveway and turned off the car. For a moment, they just sat there. Then the chief looked at Darnell and said, "You did the right thing today. You stayed calm. You didn't let them push you around." Darnell shrugged. "I didn't really do anything." His father shook his head. "You did. You showed them that they were wrong. And you reminded me why I do this job." Darnell turned to look at him. "To fire bad cops. To make sure there are fewer of them," his father corrected. "And to make sure kids like you don't have to be afraid." Darnell thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. Maybe today had been a lesson for more than just those two officers. The next morning, Darnell woke up feeling a little different. He had always heard stories about things like what happened to him, but he never thought he would experience it himself. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it. He got dressed and went downstairs, where his father was already sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and reading the news on his tablet. His mother was in the kitchen, making breakfast, and the smell of eggs and toast filled the house. "Morning," Darnell said as he sat down. "Morning, son," his father replied, glancing up at him. "You sleep okay?" Darnell nodded, but he wasn't sure if that was true. His mind had been racing all night. His mother turned around, placing a plate of food in front of him. "I heard what happened yesterday," she said gently. "Are you okay?" Darnell picked at his food with his fork. "Yeah. I guess. I keep thinking about it." His father set down his tablet. "What part?" Darnell shrugged. "All of it. The way they looked at me. The way they didn't believe me when I said I lived there. The way they changed the second they found out who I was." He frowned. "It's like, my name saved me. But what if I was just some other kid?" His parents exchanged a look. His mother sighed, sitting down next to him. "It's not fair," she said softly. "And it's not right. But that's why your father does what he does." Darnell looked at his father. "But what about the cops who don't get caught?" The chief sighed, leaning back in his chair. "There are always going to be people who do the wrong thing, son. But there are also people fighting to change that. People who hold them accountable. That's why what happened yesterday was important." Darnell thought about that for a moment. "I just don't get how they could treat me like that. They didn't even think before they acted." His father nodded. "Because to them, you weren't a person first. You were a suspect. And that's the problem." Darnell exhaled. "So what now? They lose their jobs, and that's it." His father shook his head. "It's not just about them. It's about making sure things change, making sure officers understand that this kind of behavior won't be ignored." His mother placed a comforting hand on Darnell's arm. "You're not responsible for what happened to them. They made their choices." Darnell nodded slowly, but he still felt uneasy. He pushed his food around on his plate, his appetite gone. Then his father spoke again. "You recorded it, didn't you?" Darnell looked up, surprised. "Yeah." His father smiled slightly. "Good. Hold on to that. One day, that proof might help change things." Darnell didn't know if his father was right, but for the first time since yesterday, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had done something that mattered. A few days passed, but the incident still lingered in Darnell's mind. He had gone back to school, gone through his usual routine, but something felt different. It wasn't just about what happened, it was about why it happened. And no matter how much he tried to push it away, the questions kept coming back. One afternoon, he sat in the living room, scrolling through his phone. He hadn't told anyone at school about what happened, but the local news had picked up the story. Someone must have leaked it because there it was, an article about 2 officers being dismissed after wrongly stopping a teenager. It didn't mention his name, but he knew it was about him. His father walked into the room, holding his own phone. "It's getting attention," he said, nodding toward Darnell's screen. Darnell looked up. "Yeah, I saw." The chief sat down across from him. "How do you feel about it?" Darnell sighed. "I don't know. I'm glad people are talking about it, but at the same time." He hesitated, trying to find the right words. It shouldn't have taken this for people to care. His father nodded. You're right. But sometimes, real change only happens when the truth is exposed. He leaned forward slightly. And you did that. Darnell frowned. I didn't really do anything. I just recorded it. That's more than enough, his father said firmly. That recording proved what happened. It held them accountable. Darnell thought about that. The idea that something as simple as pressing record could make such a big difference was both powerful and frustrating. Why did people need proof to believe what was happening? Just then, his phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't recognize. Hey, I saw the news. That was you, right? Darnell's heart skipped. He hesitated before typing back. Who's this? The reply came fast. It doesn't matter. Just wanted to say, thanks for speaking up. Some of us don't get that chance. Darnell stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He didn't know who it was, but suddenly, he realized something. This wasn't just about him. His father watched his expression change. Something wrong. Darnell shook his head, a small but determined look in his eyes. No, he said. I think I just figured something out. His father smiled slightly. What's that? Darnell looked up, a new kind of confidence in his voice. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to someone else. The chief nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. Now that's how you change things. Darnell took a deep breath. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to forget this moment, and he wasn't going to stay silent. Not anymore.